Did you know that between 1640 and 1783, European nations made a staggering $260 billion from selling slaves? That's equivalent to almost $1.4 trillion in today's money. And it's safe to say that this was one of the most profitable businesses in history. But which nation reaped the biggest rewards? Well, that title belongs to Britain. By the 18th century, Britain had become the world's largest slave-trading nation. In fact, at one point, the British Empire was responsible for 1 out of every 4 slaves transported across the Atlantic. So just how rich did this trade make Britain? Well, to answer the question, let's take a closer look at how the slave trade worked and who the main players were. To put it simply, the slave trade was a triangular affair. European nations like Britain, Portugal, and Spain would send ships to Africa loaded with goods like textiles, alcohol, and guns. They would then sell these goods to local African rulers in exchange for slaves. The Europeans would transport these slaves to the Americas, where they would be sold to plantation owners who needed labor for crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar. These plantations would then produce goods that were shipped back to Europe, completing the triangle. Now, the interesting thing is that while all of these European nations profited from the slave trade, the amount of wealth each nation generated varied significantly. And by the 18th century, Britain had overtaken Portugal and Spain to become the biggest player in the game. But why? Well, one reason was that Britain had a head start. The British East India Company, for example, began trading slaves in the 1660s, giving them a significant advantage over their European rivals. Additionally, Britain's geographical location was ideal for this trade. The nation's port cities like Liverpool and Bristol were perfectly situated to receive and ship slaves to the Americas. As such, these ports became hubs of the slave trade and contributed significantly to the growth of Britain's economy. In fact, the growth of Britain's port cities was so closely tied to the slave trade that when the trade was abolished in 1807, these cities were some of the first to feel the economic pain. But it wasn't just the port cities that benefited. Britain's merchants and plantation owners also reaped huge rewards. After all, it was these individuals who purchased slaves to work on their plantations in the Americas. And as the demand for slave labor grew, so did their wealth. So just how wealthy did these individuals become? Well, one estimate suggests that by the end of the 18th century, Britain's richest merchants